Some truths aren't forgotten because we dismiss them. They're forgotten because we fear what they might reveal. Zurich, late autumn, 1960. The leaves outside Jung's lakeside home were beginning to fall. Inside, the fireplace was still lit, and on the table beside his armchair lay a letter never sent, never published, sealed in an envelope without a name. It was found decades later among his private papers, not a clinical note, not a dream analysis, but something deeper, a quiet confession, a final reflection about the part of the human soul we often bury the deepest, the shadow. But this wasn't just a theory. This was Jung's answer to a question few dared to ask out loud. What happens to the parts of ourselves we never faced after we die? In this lost letter, he didn't speak as a psychoanalyst. He spoke as a soul approaching the threshold. He wrote about the darkness we hide, the pain we suppress, the guilt we never name, and how all of it might follow us into what comes next. He believed that if the soul survives death, so too does the shadow, not as punishment, but as memory, as unresolved energy, as an echo waiting for closure. What you do not integrate in life, he warned, you may be forced to meet more clearly in death. In the next 30 minutes, we will walk through Jung's final reflections, not as a lecture, but as a journey into the parts of ourselves we rarely look at, and into the realm that may still hold them, long after the heartbeat ends. Because the truth is simple, the body dies, but the story doesn't, and sometimes it is the unfinished story that lingers the longest. Let us begin. It was a quiet room, tucked away in a lakeside house in Küsnacht, Switzerland, the kind of room where time seems to settle. Carl Jung had always preferred silence over spectacle, and in the final months of his life, that silence deepened. He no longer traveled, rarely lectured, spent most of his mornings walking beneath bare trees, and his afternoons beside a fireplace that crackled like an old friend whispering things the world had forgotten. But what few people know is this: Jung kept writing, not for publication, not for students, but for himself. Among the pages found after his death was a letter, unfinished, unsigned, no date, no recipient, only the soft indentation of a trembling hand. The handwriting was slower than his published works, but the message was sharper. It wasn't clinical. It wasn't philosophical. It was personal. In this letter, Jung wrote not about dream symbols or collective myths. He wrote about what happens after the final breath, but not in the way you might expect. He didn't speak of heaven or hell. He didn't promise light or punishment. What he described was a recognition. The psyche does not end with death. He wrote, what is not integrated in life seeks integration in what follows. To Jung, the greatest risk was not the end of the body. It was the continuation of the unconscious, the shadow we carry but refuse to name. He believed that when we die, we do not simply vanish. We enter a space that mirrors us, and what we refuse to face in life may greet us with stunning clarity in death. Man's task, he had written elsewhere, is to become conscious of that which presses upwards from the unconscious. If he does not, it will confront him in symbolic form there, or beyond. In his last letter, Jung didn't sound afraid. He sounded concerned not for himself, but for those who lived their lives avoiding their deepest truths. The rage left unspoken, the grief buried beneath productivity, the shame wrapped in silence. Death, he wrote, does not free us from ourselves. It frees us into ourselves. This was his unfinished warning, not a threat, but an invitation to look inward, now to tend to what has been exiled, because one day, when everything else falls away, what remains is not your title, not your history, but the truth you did or did not face, and that, Jung believed, is what decides whether the soul rests or returns. Carl Jung never treated the shadow as a metaphor. To him, it was real, not in the way a bone is real, but in the way a buried memory is real, hidden, powerful, and waiting. The shadow, Jung wrote, is the part of the psyche we deny. It's the anger we suppress to stay polite, the envy we never name because we want to appear kind. It's the guilt we carry without ever admitting we're wounded. But most dangerously, the shadow is what we project onto others. We see selfishness in someone else and forget it's the selfishness we haven't forgiven in ourselves. We condemn what we secretly feel drawn to, and we praise only what makes us feel safe. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. But what happens when life ends, and we've never made that unconscious material conscious? He believed the shadow doesn't disappear with the body. It remains, not to haunt, but to seek completion, because everything we bury still vibrates. And in Jung's view, the psyche is not contained within the skull. It is part of something deeper, something larger. And it continues. The shadow is not evil, Jung wrote. It is unrecognized potential, and potential ignored becomes destructive. When the body dies, the social mask falls away, but the soul, now stripped of its roles, must meet what it once refused. This is not punishment. It is physics of the psyche. What is unprocessed seeks movement. What is unacknowledged demands presence. And in death, when distractions fall silent, the unresolved parts of the self come forward. Imagine it like this. You've left the stage. The play is over. The audience is gone. But behind the curtain stands every character you silenced, every emotion you exiled, every truth you didn't allow yourself to speak. They don't accuse you. They wait for you to finally see them, to finally see you. This is the core of Jung's insight, that wholeness is the goal of the soul. Not perfection, not performance, but integration, and if we do not achieve it in life, we may seek it more urgently in death, not through fear, but through necessity, because what the soul truly longs for is not escape, it's return. Return to the self fully seen, fully claimed, fully whole, and to Jung, the shadow was not the thing that blocked that return, it was the doorway to it. So the real question is not what is the shadow, but are we willing to meet it before we cross that final threshold? That's where we go next, into the emotional baggage the soul still carries. Long after the body lets go, Carl Jung once wrote, "The soul would have no rainbow if the eyes had no tears. But what if the tears we never shed still follow us long after death?" To Jung, emotions weren't fleeting. They were formative. Every feeling we suppress, sorrow, guilt, rage, shame, doesn't vanish. It settles, it stores, and it shapes the landscape of the inner world. He believed the soul carries not only memory, but emotional weight, especially the emotions that were never fully lived or understood. Imagine a suitcase. You pack it with things you don't want to deal with. Old griefs, childhood wounds, betrayals never spoken aloud. You carry that suitcase your entire life. You grow used to its weight. But when you die, you don't drop it. You open it. Jung believed that after death, in the absence of the physical body, we are faced not with judgment, but with resonance, with what still vibrates inside us. And what vibrates the strongest is what was never brought into awareness. We are not punished for our emotions, he said, but we are shaped by the emotions we deny. In this sense, death is not an escape. It is a mirror, and that mirror reflects not who we appeared to be, but what we carried silently, constantly. Jung described the psyche as layered, conscious mind at the surface, personal unconscious beneath, and deeper still, the collective unconscious. But between those layers, he believed there are complexes, clusters of emotion, memory, and meaning that never fully integrated, wounds that still throb even after the event has passed. And the most powerful complexes are those linked to identity. I am not enough. I am unlovable. I failed them. These aren't thoughts. They are energetic signatures, and according to Jung, they echo in the soul. Until we face them, the emotional baggage we carry becomes emotional gravity after death. It pulls us not toward light or darkness, but toward what still needs healing. Some souls, he believed, feel stuck, not because they are being punished, but because something inside them is still waiting for closure, a conversation never had, a truth never spoken, a forgiveness never offered especially to the self. And in that liminal space, that space between lives, the soul begins to remember not just what it did, but what it denied. Wholeness requires ownership, Jung said, even of what we do not wish to see. This is why some people report visions of long-lost family members, unfinished stories, emotions that rise like waves during near-death experiences. The body may be unconscious, but the psyche continues, and what continues with it is what still needs to be seen. So ask yourself, what pain still lingers unspoken? What emotion have you tucked so far down, you've stopped calling it yours? Because when the noise of life fades and the story ends, that emotion may be the first thing that rises, not to haunt you, but to ask, are you ready to come home? To all of you. In the next part of Jung's vision, we'll explore what happens when these parts remain unresolved, and the realm where the shadow lingers, waiting to be remembered. Jung never described the afterlife as a destination. He described it as a continuation of inner reality, a psychic landscape shaped by what we faced in life and what we refused to. And so, he asked a question few dared to consider. If the conscious mind dies with the body, but the unconscious remains, where does it go? He didn't give a definitive answer. Jung was never interested in fixed dogma. What he offered instead was a possibility that after death, the soul may enter a symbolic realm, a liminal space, where the fragments of the self come forward more clearly than ever. He called it the psychic field of transition. Others might call it limbo, bardo, or purgatory, but to Jung, it was deeply personal. It is not a place, he wrote, but a mirror, and in that mirror, the unintegrated self becomes the environment. What does that mean? It means if you lived your life afraid of your anger, you may enter a realm shaped by fear. If you buried shame for decades, you may find yourself surrounded by echoes of judgment, not because you are being punished, but because the soul, once unbound from the body, has nothing left to protect it from its own reflection. Jung believed these realms are not eternal, but they feel real because they are real. Emotionally, symbolically, they are projections of the shadow we never faced. Only now, there is no career to hide behind, no family roles to fulfill, no noise to distract us from what lingers inside. And some souls stay there, a person who dies without ever confronting their shadow, Jung warned, may wander in realms shaped by the very forces they once denied. These are the hungry ghosts of Buddhist thought, the restless spirits in myth. But Jung did not see them as supernatural beings. He saw them as unresolved energy, still seeking integration. This may explain why certain places feel heavy. Old hospitals, battlefields, or family homes where silence stretched for decades. The psyche, Jung believed, can imprint itself on space when it cannot move forward. So what happens then? Can these shadow realms be escaped? Yes, but not through denial, only through awareness. The only way out, he wrote, is through recognition. Some souls begin to see the projections for what they are: old beliefs, false stories, inherited shame. And when they do, the realm begins to dissolve, not because they've earned it, but because they've finally faced themselves. Jung believed that even in death, individuation continues. The path toward wholeness does not end with the heartbeat. It simply changes form. So we must ask, what shadow are we projecting onto the world today? What part of us, if left unseen, might become the very landscape we meet when the body is gone. In the next chapter of Jung's Hidden Insights, we explore what happens when the soul begins to reclaim these shadows, not through force, but through reflection, and how projection doesn't end at death. It may become the afterlife itself. Carl Jung often said that the psyche projects its contents outward, not because we intend to deceive, but because we are not yet ready to see what lives within. We accuse others of being selfish when our own desires go unspoken. We see betrayal in every glance when our trust has never healed. The shadow isn't evil, it's simply unseen. But what happens to that projection after death, when there's no longer a physical world to anchor it? Jung believed that the afterlife, in its first unfolding, is deeply psychological, not in the rational sense, but in the symbolic. He saw it as a dream state intensified, one where the soul enters a space made of its own inner images, its own fears, desires, and forgotten truths. What is not made conscious in life, he wrote, becomes the canvas of death. And in this space, projection doesn't stop, it amplifies. If you've spent your life fearing judgment, you may enter a realm filled with faces watching you, not because others are judging you, but because you never stopped judging yourself. If you lived addicted to control, you may awaken in a realm where everything slips through your hands. If you denied your capacity for love, you may walk through fields where every figure you meet is a stranger who looks like someone you once refused to forgive. In this way, Jung believed the afterlife could begin as a symbolic projection of the very patterns we never dared to integrate. He wasn't trying to scare us. He was offering a profound invitation to stop projecting now, while we are alive, so that death doesn't become a hall of mirrors, but a door to clarity. The soul does not meet God, Jung once said. It meets itself, and in that meeting, what was denied becomes visible, what was feared becomes form, and what was exiled becomes the scenery of your next journey. This is why in certain near-death experiences, people don't speak of angels or fire, but of places, vast, emotional landscapes, endless corridors, empty rooms, voices that say nothing, yet sound familiar. They are not hallucinations. They are symbolic fields, created by the soul's last known resonance. Jung believed that every soul, when stripped of its earthly roles, is met not by an outside force, but by the image it has spent its life building inwardly. So he warned, gently, if you do not meet your shadow now, you may wake into it later. But there is hope in this, because if projection follows us after death, so does awareness, so does healing. And just as the psyche can project a shadow, it can also reclaim it. The same energy that once formed landscapes of fear can become light, not metaphorical light, but a kind of internal recognition that dissolves the illusion and reveals the truth. Because projection is not the end, it's the beginning of awakening, when the soul, finally alone with itself, begins to ask the questions it once ran from, and from there, the real healing begins. In the next chapter, we enter that realm, not of projection, but of integration, the healing field, the place where the soul meets its shadow one last time, not with fear, but with understanding. Not all souls wander, not all become trapped in projection. Some, after the initial mirroring, after the unveiling of the shadow, enter what Carl Jung believed to be the most sacred phase of postmortem consciousness, the healing field. This was not a place with walls or gates, not heaven as described in Scripture, nor punishment as feared by tradition. It was a symbolic field, a psychic dimension in which the soul, stripped of illusion, stands before the full map of its inner world. The soul longs not for escape, Jung wrote, but for integration, for reconciliation with what it once feared to feel. And so, within this field, the shadow does not chase, it waits. It stands as memory, image, sensation, waiting for the soul to see it, to recognize This was never the enemy. This was always the part of you left in the cold. The healing field, according to Jung, is not quiet because nothing moves. It's quiet because everything is listening. Here, the soul begins to re-encounter the fragments it split off in life. Not abstract concepts, but vivid experiences. A child self, still weeping. A teenage moment of rage, still burning. A face once hated, now understood. The echo of a decision that changed everything, still suspended, waiting to be forgiven. And in this field, forgiveness is not something granted. It's something remembered. The soul remembers its wholeness, and the shadow remembers it was never darkness, only pain left unseen. The psyche seeks unity, Jung said, and it will find that unity in life or in death. Many near-death experiencers describe a life review, but not as judgment, as feeling. They feel the love they gave and the love they withheld. They feel the pain they caused and the pain they carried alone. They feel not to be punished, but to understand, because understanding is how the soul begins to heal. Jung believed this process mirrors what he called individuation in life. The slow merging of the conscious self with the unconscious contents of the psyche. Except now, in death, the resistance is gone. There is no more social mask. No need to appear perfect. There is only what is and what wants to be whole again. In this healing field, symbols take form. The soul might walk through forests it's never seen, touch doors it never opened in life, hear voices it never dared to listen to, but they all point to the same direction, home. Not to a location, but to a state of inner resonance, where every disowned part finds its place in the pattern again. Jung believed this is where the decision is made. Does the soul return to another life, another spiral of experience? Or does it rest, not out of exhaustion, but because the vibration has resolved? This realm, he said, is not final, but it is foundational, because a soul that has not made peace with its shadow will carry that dissonance into its next form, but a soul that meets its shadow with love transforms it. What we reconcile becomes part of our strength, Jung wrote, and what we understand ceases to control us. In the next part of this journey, we look at what happens when the soul chooses not to rest, but to return, to live again, not as punishment, but as refinement, because the shadow, once met, doesn't end, it evolves. Carl Jung didn't believe in punishment after death. He believed in continuation. He believed the psyche, with all its light and shadow, doesn't vanish when the body dissolves. It persists, and it seeks completion. In life, we distract, we minimize, we numb, but the soul has no interest in avoidance. It doesn't care if your career was successful, if your reputation remained clean, if no one ever saw your tears. It only cares about truth, wholeness, integration. And if we don't do that work now, in this life, Jung believed we would do it later, in the space beyond the breath, or perhaps in the life that follows. One does not become enlightened, Jung wrote, by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The message was never about fear. It was about responsibility. What you run from now may become the very reason you return. Jung theorized that reincarnation, if it exists, is not imposed. It is chosen, not by force, but by resonance. The soul, he said, returns to where it left its work undone. That means if you die still carrying deep resentment, you may be drawn back into relationships that echo betrayal, until forgiveness becomes the frequency that frees you. If you die having never spoken your truth, you may return with a burning need to be heard, until you find your voice and use it with love. If you die never knowing how to love without control, you may come back to learn the fragile, liberating power of letting go. It's not karma in the way we often hear it. It's energetic continuity. The patterns repeat, not to trap you, but to show you what still lives in you. Jung believed that each life is not a punishment, but a classroom, and the curriculum is simple. Everything you reject will come again, not to harm you, but to be healed. This is why you may feel drawn to places you've never been, or meet someone who feels familiar within seconds. Why certain emotions rise like old ghosts with no name. You're not cursed. You're remembering. And what returns is what still needs your light. What you resist not only persists, Jung said, it grows in the dark. But here's the gift. Everything you face now, with honesty, compassion, and courage, becomes lighter, not just in this life, but in the lives to come. You lessen the shadow not by perfection, but by presence. The truth is, the work you do now matters more than you know, not just for your peace today, but for the path you shape tomorrow. Because in Jung's view, the soul doesn't carry status. It carries vibration, and when the body falls away, that's all that remains. The resonance of what you've healed, and what you still long to. In the final part of this journey, we arrive at the question Jung never stopped asking. What does it mean to become whole, not just in life, but beyond it? And how do we prepare for death? Not with fear, but with integration. By the end of his life, Carl Jung had come to a quiet conclusion that the work of the soul is not about avoiding darkness, but about learning how to carry it with grace. He no longer spoke in terms of pathology or diagnosis. He spoke in terms of integration, because he saw something most people missed. You don't get rid of the shadow. You welcome it home. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung wrote, is to become who you truly are, and to become who you truly are. You must first meet what you've refused to be. So the question becomes, how do we set the shadow free before we die? Not in theory, not someday, but now. Jung offered no magic formula, no ritual, no single moment of transformation. What he offered instead were simple, sacred steps, subtle acts of courage available to anyone. First, name what has been silent, the emotion you've pushed down for decades, the jealousy you hide behind kindness, the pain that still whispers when the room is quiet. Naming is not blaming, it's illuminating, and what we illuminate loses its grip. Second, speak to your shadow as if it were a child, because it is. The shadow often begins in childhood. It is the part of you that learned to stay quiet, to be strong, to never be a burden, but it's still there, waiting for you to say, I see you now. You're allowed to exist. Third, write what you cannot say aloud. Letters you'll never send. Stories that still ache. Fears too old to explain. Put them on paper. Let them breathe outside your mind. Because even unspoken truths deserve air. Fourth, practice radical empathy starting with yourself. The way you forgive others. Try forgiving the parts of you that fell apart. Not to excuse what happened, but to release the version of you that still lives inside the wound. And finally, make room for silence, not as escape, but as encounter. Jung believed that in silence, the unconscious speaks, and often what it says is, you're not broken, you're unfinished. This is how you prepare for death, not by denying it, not by fearing it, but by arriving at it, already whole. Because when the final breath comes, you will not be asked, were you perfect? You will be asked, did you meet yourself fully? And if the answer is yes, then nothing in you needs to hide. Not in this life, not in the next. Your vision will become clear. Jung wrote, only when you can look into your own heart, who looks outside, dreams, who looks inside, awakens. So look inside while there's still time, not to fix yourself, but to reclaim yourself, because the shadow is not the part of you that must be feared. It is the part of you that has waited the longest to be loved, and that is the beginning of freedom. If something in this story lingered, if you felt a quiet ache, a flicker of memory, or the sense that some part of you was listening deeper than usual, then trust that you didn't just watch this video. You walked alongside a question that lives inside all of us. Have I met myself completely, or am I still hiding from my own reflection? Carl Jung never claimed to have all the answers, but he left behind a map, not of the stars, but of the soul. And on that map, there is always one final note. Wholeness is not found in the light alone. It's found where the light meets the shadow and stays. So before you go, take a moment, not to move on, but to look in. What part of you is still waiting to be seen? If this message resonated, leave a comment below, not for applause, but for connection. Let us know what part of this journey stirred something in you. Because when one person speaks their truth, another person finds the courage to face theirs. And if you're walking your own quiet path of remembering, subscribe so we can walk it together, not to chase answers, but to stay present with the mystery. Until next time, live gently, love deeply, and don't forget, the shadow you fear is often the doorway to the soul you've been searching for.